All right. Greetings. Thank you for being here. All right. So today, I just did a video around literally my created 9-day calendar. I shared a little bit about it. It's confusing, I know, when I share it outwardly, but it would be because we are indoctrinated into calendars and time. So I did some more research, and this is exciting. So I learned in the last few days, or I guess the last week, around the star system, the moon, and the sun, and what I had said. And I actually found receipts, so to speak, recipes to solidify how I had talked about how most things on the calendar, in the calendar, are either star or moon based, very little based on the sun. So I did a little research around females involved with star knowledge. And I found quite a few people that have female humans that are responsible for a lot of what we know today around the stars, around measuring literally the cosmos, and the first writings. So we're gonna go into Venus and Sirius, otherwise known as Sobdet, and the link to the calendar, and even some subtle theories around why Venus might have been called the sun, because everything goes back to the stars and the moon. Our religious holidays, even Psalms, okay? Psalms is linked to the stars because Psalms links to harvest and life and the continuance of life. And so I bring that up because we're going to talk about a goddess, also a living being, okay? And I'm going to get into the other great mothers linked to the stars. If you want to do some of your own kind of pre-knowledge, I want to share this. We have Anne Jump Cannon, Cecilia Payne, Galpskin, Henrietta Leavitt, Hypatia, and Carolyn Herschel, giving us things around the stars that many give credit to males, and it was never males, it was always females, and bringing me to who I'm speaking of today specifically, our ancient Sumerian first author, by the way, first documented author, supposedly. This is what we're told. And again, most of our information is handed down through the colonizers, so I don't want to dismiss that possibility. However, the fact that it is a female and she's linked to the stars, I find important. Okay, so I started the search around women who made calendars, women who invented or created calendars. Now, I'm just going to reiterate what I found before I get into who I'm speaking about, just as a reminder. One of my members, one of the members and one of my friends mentioned, what does the moon calendar, or the moon and stars, specifically the 9-day calendar, and the 9-day calendar, or the 9 planetary calendar is my creation. But the reason why I went that way is because in the reverence of great mothers, in the recognitions of the matriarchal beginnings, and that great mothers are the teachers of all, I use my own theories around it. But what I am not, that is the 9 planetary calendar is a theory of mine, and I try to describe how I came up with it. But what I did not come up with, what has always been around, which is a remembrance, and it has been proven, is that great mothers were the original first timekeepers. They were the first teachers. They were also the first quote-unquote timekeepers. And when we talk about timekeeping, it was based on observation. It was a lived experience. It was taught orally, and it was tracked through our own bodies. Seasons are what are called seasons, but we're going to get into that. I hope I remember to get into that. Births and moons. And births weren't recorded like we record them today. They were recognized, okay? And this was overwhelmingly females. If you were in this position, it was handed down to you. If you were male and you were in this position, you earned that position. You earned that position. It wasn't just given to you because you were male. And so what we do see is that great mothers and females were in the positions at the center of continuity around the community and continuity around what was considered timekeeping, okay? And so calendars were developed by watching the moon, watching our own moon cycles, our menstrual cycles, observing plants, tides, and animal behavior. I've gone into this in some of my other videos. We tracked pregnancy length, weaning, and again, seasons, or what seemed like seasons, but what we recognized was like wet, dry, hot, cold, because in Southern California, what is considered winter, it's warm. But in Buffalo, New York, they are seeing what is called winter, and that is then called a season. But we didn't really call things seasons. And also, just in general, we might not have been living in the area that gets tons and tons of snow. We probably migrated, and when we migrated, we based it on the stars and or the moon, or both, because the stars tell us where the sun's going to be, not the other way around. So, bringing us to the lady of the topic of the day, of the night, of the evening, of the moment, is Enheduanna. Enheduanna. Her name is in the title, and I'm going to spell it for you again. Enheduanna. And she is said to have been living 2300 BCE. And my theory is that time, how they've told us, is skewed. So let that just, however you calculate the years and such. And we're going to even get into year. All right. So Enheduanna was a high priestess of Inanna in Sumer. Now, Inanna and Venus are one and the same. Inanna and Venus in this culture were one and the same. And this is why I was questioning the idea of Venus being connected to the sun. Because if we did follow the stars and we handed stories through the stars and we decided our doings through the stars, and if Venus was going to be the one to tell us, would we not consider that the main star? The star of the stars? More important than the sun? Okay, just a thought. Just a thought. So she also oversaw ritual calendars tied to specifically lunar cycles. She has hymns that align celestial movement with what is considered civic time or social communal time. And she is one of the earliest named women shaping calendrical rhythm. Okay? I've explained how calendars today are about control, but they weren't. They were around when to plant, when to rest, when you were having your cycle, your menstruation cycle, when to conceive and give birth, when to grieve, and when to celebrate. We didn't just make calendars. We kept what we now call calendars alive. We kept the cycle alive. We kept time alive. Life was an example of time, but also by looking at nature, we were able to see cycles. Okay, so Enheduanna was a high priestess of the moon god, and the moon god was Inanna. And we've talked about Namu. Okay, this does go back to the Sumerians. However, I just wanted to throw that in there because Inanna is also where we get Inanna, but Inanna was the moon and Inanna was Venus. Okay, Enheduanna was a royal daughter of Sargon of Akkad. Her importance was not just political. She is also the earliest named author in recorded history. So when people say that Thoth taught writing, are they actually referring to her? Bringing it back to her? Because earliest named author in recorded history, the first to write, a female. This is a fact, okay? This is shown. We have evidence of this, all right? She also is a woman whose words shaped ritual calendars, temple timing, and cosmic order. As a high priestess, she was responsible for aligning rituals with lunar cycles, maintaining the sacred calendar, synchronizing city life, agriculture, and what we call worship or observation of the heavens, and teaching cosmology through hymns and poetry. So this goes back to even Psalms, because Psalms are hymns. This is a mirrored ancient ritual, so to speak. So Psalms will relate back to forever, new beginnings and changes. And the hymns around Inanna or Venus and this sacred calendar were stories specifically taught and songs specifically taught for remembrance of the positions and importance of the stars. Her writings were not prayers, they were timekeeping instructions encoded in devotion or encoded in what we now call ritual. Her writings were so important. She wrote hymns to Inanna, the great goddess of Venus. Venus and Inanna are the same. Her hymns also were in reference to the cycles of descent and return, because you see that with the stars, and power, fertility, adversaries, and sovereignty. Okay, her most famous work is the exaltation of Inanna, and that goes to planetary movement, specifically Venus, political order, human emotion. We were aware of human emotions. This was something very important because we understood if your emotions are not in check, everything else starts to go off. When your emotions are in balance, when you're not impulsive and not reactive, things flow well. And you can see this in nature. Also, sacred time, how important giving observation was. Her teachings taught how the cosmic order and human order mirror one another. This, to me, kind of shows the as above, so below concept again. So, what she also did is she formalized female-held lunar knowledge. That was her. And then she taught it to others. Through her, learner time became civic time. Goddess cycles became state of rhythm, and women's observation became written cosmology. It became written, but it has always been an oral mother knowledge. an oral mother knowledge. It became written through her, one of the first recorded authors. Okay? Again, astronomically, Inanna is Venus. Okay? So, do you see how Venus, also named Inanna, becomes a deity through stories? We are literally bringing a star planetary story to Earth through oral knowledge to be remembered so that we can recognize how to do things, how to plant, when to move, when to have when we're having our moon cycles, when we're having our gestation cycles, when we're fertility cycles, when we do ceremony, when we do remembrance, when it is time to plant and when it is time to harvest. Now, the importance of Venus and stars in general. So, what is called Inanna's descent is actual Venus's Sidonic cycle, okay? And Venus's cycle is 584 days. Venus disappears from the sky, goes into the underworld. Venus returns as the morning star or the evening star. So, on our part of the planet, during certain times of year, we either have Sirius, aka Sopdet, or Venus as either the morning or evening star, depending on where you're at and what time of year it is. Okay, so Venus will sometimes be the morning star and sometimes be the evening star. When Venus is the evening star, Sirius is the morning star. When Venus is the morning star, Sirius is the evening star. Okay? And within that descent and cycle is the transformative idea around power, death, rebirth, sovereignty, timing, all encoded in that cycle. Okay? And this was Enheduanna's job. This was her priestess duty. Okay? And then the hymns were given to track Inanna's changing states. And through that, this would align ritual power with Venus's appearances. So depending on when Venus was appearing, morning or evening, would also dictate their ceremonies or rituals, so to speak. And we teach that the authority comes from cosmic timing. Okay? This is what can be called planetary literacy. The awareness and literature around stars, planets, and the moon. She utilized Venus, aka Inanna's cycle, with specific things related to the state or cities or the community, and linked moon, Venus, agriculture, and governance into one rhythm. This was part of the matriarchal ways of doing things, or the matriarchal sovereignty of doing things. This also laid groundwork for the lunar solar calendars that were used in Mesopotamia, later on the Babylonian planetary tracking, and the idea that heavenly cycles regulate earthly order, as above, so below. I'm adding that part, the as above, so below, because that's literally what it's telling us, how they're directly linked. She used her star knowledge and observance to solidify a translated way of looking at it, aka a calendar. So her information carried on into Babylonian astrology. Venus tracking becomes systematic. Planetary cycles are recorded mathematically. And goddesses slowly became planets. Not just what was considered sovereign beings, but this is something that shifted during the Babylonian time. Temple-based timekeeping, priestly calendars are tied to celestial observation. Easter is based on the moon. Okay, our holidays are based, New Year's, we're going to get into New Year's because we are given New Year's, but that New Year's that we are given is Egyptian, and it's based on Sirius. Period. Because our calendars went from no time, which Greenwich Mean Time and the meridian was a politically based world order, so to speak. The Europeans claimed that area of the planet and that system to control all time, because we didn't do that. Each peoples or groups, depending on where they're at, had their own way of doing a calendar. There wasn't a universal calendar, so to speak, like we see today, where we are doing New Year's on January 1st. And this is almost everywhere except for, say, China, where we know that they will be celebrating the New Year's in February, right? It's based off of the moon. Yet all of these countries still agree to recognize the places that utilize Greenwich Mean Time and the meridian. And the meridian carries the name Mary Diana because why? Because the theory is that Mary Diana were the original teachers, mothers, and looked at to guide. So you're going to utilize those sounds, you're going to utilize that theory to then bring a systematic sense of control over time. And it wasn't based on to make us feel good about what time it was based on control and taxation. Okay? So over time, it became temple-based timekeeping, where then it became a priest doing calendars. Ritual timing becomes standardized or only given to certain people. No longer are great mothers included or even utilized for this information, and their roles diminish, okay? Or they get completely left out, right? And then we have mythic calendars like Persephone, Isis, Ishtar, all right? They mirror this great mother's information. They mirror the Venus logic, okay? And then feminine cycles remain encoded even when the names change, like Sirius, which used to be soaked in, okay? Or when we call it the Big Dipper instead of Ursa Major and Minor, the Great Bears, all right? Okay, and so a little bit more about Enheduanna and her link to stars and planetary function. This is where cultures talk about sacred days, festival, planetary hours. Okay, these were structured after Enheduanna's knowledge and observation. Okay, even though we may not have heard of her. Have you heard of her? This is why I'm bringing her to you. Okay. So the key here is that watching the stars, specifically Venus, aka Inanna, was giving cycles of disappearance and return, or death and rebirth, or a new cycle. So, for example, the reason why New Year's that we see is also celebrated in Egypt, or Egypt's New Year's is based around Sirius. I'm not exactly sure if they have the same New Year that we do, but their New Year is based on Sirius, and Sirius has a 365-day cycle. Sirius does, as far as when it sets and then when it rises. Okay? Now, Enheduanna also contributed to Inanna, the moon god, okay, utilizing lunar months structured around her priestess duties or her job, and that moon governs calendars. The moon does. I've already said this before, just out of looking at my own calculations, how influential the moon is. And then this brings me to the Pleiades, because when we get into the North American cultures, the Pleiades were the stars that were noticed. They were the most important stars in the North and South Americas. The Pleiades were the star tellers, the great mothers of the sky. So again, we're looking at as above, so below. This brings me back to the global female star knowledge. It was the great mothers who studied the stars and the moon. It was great mothers who figured out ritual, when to plant, when to harvest, by following the stars, by noticing the stars. This would take years. So the first great mothers to figure this out, it took years. And then they taught it to their daughters. And then their daughters taught it to their daughters. And how did their daughters teach it? Through song. Through song. So we still see this today. Okay, so a little link to the songs and psalms. So early hymns and psalms function as seasonal, calendrical, and cosmic memory tools. All right? With Enheduanna's hymns, they were songs that charted. They chanted certain texts or symbols. They were performed in temples. They were repeated cyclically, and they were tied to specific ritual rites linking to Inanna or Nana. Okay, and this is just with her. And you will see this around the world depending on what stars, what names were given. But we see it with the pyramids. We see it with the pyramids all over the world. The pyramids are in positions that reflect the stars. Okay? And the stars are what tells us where the sun is going to be again. Okay? So, also with the hymns, I'm separating hymns from psalms, even though technically hymns and psalms, aka songs, are the same. Okay? But we're separating them from time and from kind of the structural aspect of it, okay? Because the books of Psalms is older. It emerges from older Mesopotamian hymn traditions, temple chant cultures, call and response of oral practices, and seasonal and festival observances. So even though they are not exactly the same, the Psalms are pure Hebrew, and Enheduanna is Sumerian and Akkadian. And so one is complete, like the language is separate, but the mirroring is familiar, similar. Why psalms? Why songs? Why hymns? If people couldn't read, they could sing, and they could remember the words to songs. Calendars weren't always printed. Even though she was the first recorded author, did she write down a calendar? Maybe, maybe not. I should look into that. But calendars weren't always written down. They were handed down through oral tradition. And how do we help with memory? We create songs. And time was remembered through ritual repetition. So how do you remember when to plant, fast, celebrate, and have festival times? You sing it. So many psalms have reference to harvests, rains, and droughts. Psalms refer to cyclical return, like again and forever, from generation to generation. Psalms are associated with pilgrimage and festivals like Passover and Sukkot. They align with agricultural and lunar cycles. Psalms. And this is the link from Enheduanna's hymns to the modern Christian and Catholic and Hebrew psalms. So both the early hymns and psalms functioned as sung memory systems. Many of us still remember nursery songs years later, okay? So through these hymns and psalms or songs, they helped communities stay aligned with the seasonal and agricultural and cosmic cycles through singing, okay? This was smart. It was defensible. You could defend it because you had the song in memory. And this is the kind of things that scholars have noticed that helps kind of connect these ways of teaching, learning, and retaining the stories. Okay, and so I'm just going to do the link one more time. With Enheduanna, hymns corresponded to lunar cycles, Venus's disappearance and return, political and agricultural timing. Time is alive, responsive, relational. We can see it happening. We can be in the moment and know that that moment is going to pass, okay? Psalms. Many psalms correspond to agricultural seasons, pilgrimage festivals, and lunar cycles, all right? Time within psalms is sacred, cyclical, and conventional, okay? Neither is clock time. Both are seasonal time. Then we get into seasonal. That is a word that has been given to us by those who teach us. But really, things are more or less determined more by the stars than what we call seasons. Because on the equator, there is no season. There might be a rainy season, and we might call it hurricane season, like we might. That is today's language. But the peoples of the land called it, the hurricane comes from an Arawak word, the indigenous original peoples, the Arawaks, relating to the elements and beings beyond what we call gods, okay? So when it comes to what we call seasons, that is an English word. That is what we call, we have an idea of what seasons are because that's what we've been taught. But when we were as peoples, we just recognized where we were at, and we recognized where we were at and what was going to happen by the stars. So that before seasons, there was lunar and stellar time, okay? There were moon counts, star appearances or disappearances. We studied animal behavior. We studied rain patterns. We still do that. We studied heat cycles. We still do that. And the length of shadow and night. So this is where we get the solstices, okay? So the stars told women where the sun would be next. The sun didn't lead. Moon and stars did, right? So season is a flattering word, but in places like Southern California, around the equator, much of Africa, coastal regions, and equatorial zones, those places in time don't have like winter versus summer. They have dry versus wet, or windy versus still, or cool nights versus hot nights, abundancy or sparseness. It wasn't based in what we now call seasons. And these shifts were tracked more accurately by moon and stars than the sun alone, which I've mentioned before, okay? So we might have called time lunar stellar cycles, or sky-based time, or relational time, observed time, living time. We don't assume that because it's winter time, it's going to be cold everywhere, or because it's springtime, it's going to be warm everywhere, or that it matches with what we might call New Year. So we're going to get into that. Okay, quickly. The Jewish calendar is lunisolar, okay? The Islamic calendar is lunar. The Chinese calendar is lunar. Many indigenous calendars are lunar and stars. And Christian holidays, as I mentioned before, Easter is calculated by the full moon, not the sun. Okay, for example, Sirius rising is the Nile flood. That's Egypt. This is how we used to watch the stars. This is how it used to tell us to do things. The Pleiades, specifically in the Americas, planting, harvest, and marketers. That's globally. I learned this right now with you. Globally, the harvest markers, Pleiades, okay? And then the Venus cycles, connected with ritual, kinship, fertility, adversariness, and rebirth. Those are stellar calendars, not seasonal ones, okay? All right, around the International Meridian Conference. So, in 1884, and we want to remember that the 1800s are pivotal for what happened to the indigenous peoples, what happened to the indigenous peoples' creations and technology. Okay, these years, in my perception, from my studies, I theorize that these are the years of the reset, where things got retold and found and regurgitated to us, or miseducated back to us, to separate us from what was originally ours. Okay, anyhow, in 1884 at the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C., world powers voted to adopt one prime meridian, one global time standard, and Greenwich, England was chosen. Now, side note, Greenwich looks like Greenwich, and there is a story behind that, around a green witch, or the greenness, or a green meaning growth, medicine, witch. There is a story there. I have done a video on it. Anyhow, this is not because Greenwich was spiritually, or astronomically, or even a cultural center. This was specifically around Britain, controlling 70% of global shipping. Okay? British nautical charts dominated the trade, and the British Empire needed synchronization for railroads, telegraphs, naval power, and colonial administration for colonizing. Okay? So time became an infrastructure, right? This is a seizure. This is literally a seizure of control, okay? Because time was local. Noon, to many, meant when the sun was overhead here, where you are at. Not noon, it's noon here, but is the sun directly over all the way until Arizona, all the way until Mexico, New Mexico, all the way to New York. This is why there's a quote-unquote 3-hour difference, because noon in New York is different from noon in California, okay? But that's what the locals did. They depended on how they saw time, how their great mothers taught them time, okay? And then calendars were regional, lunar, stellar, and ceremonial, okay? Time became abstracted, centralized, and detached from sky, land, body ritual. Because people talk about the turtles with the calendar on their back. I have a different calendar, but it's still, the turtles of nature are showing us a way to look at what we call time. Okay, nature shows us as well. All right, so Greenwich Mean Time became a political act that standardized time and reality itself. Time literally became a construct in 1884, okay? Now, when we get to who invented the idea of a year, this is what I wanted to know. Who even came up with this? Who started this whole thing? Okay, no single, like one person invented the year, but the concept of year emerges independently across cultures. How was it defined? By each culture mattered. So the earliest year was not solar. The first years were lunar, stellar, agricultural, or ritualistic. Okay? People noticed moons repeat, stars return to the same place, animals migrate, plants cycle, especially ones that, like the oak tree, who lose all their leaves, or the willow tree, or the maple tree. It looks like they've died, but they haven't died. Okay? Even they show you a cycle. Okay? So a year, what we call a year before we started conceptualizing a year, it meant the sky has come back to itself. The star has returned to its original position that we've decided it is in, or it shifted its position. It was the sky who taught us. This is where we get some of the names like sky watchers or sky goddess. Okay, so this is the earliest, supposedly. And I debate with this one, but when you listen to how many days are in it, it kind of makes sense. But a lunar year used by the early Mesopotamians was 12 moons. And that was 354 days. I want you to notice something. 354. So 5 and 4 is 9. And then there's 3. So it becomes 12, which breaks back down to 3. So we see, 12, which equals 3, and then 354, which equals 3. So we see the power of 3, 6, and 9 in the original lunar year, okay? But it was only 354 days. 65 is only 11 more days. Anyhow, this calendar was used by early Mesopotamians, indigenous cultures globally, and it is still used in the Islamic calendar today. All right? That is also why Ramadan and Chinese New Year are the same day this year. Okay? Begins that night this year. And again, we come back to the importance of night, the importance of being able to see the moon and the stars. Okay? So that old system drifts against seasons unless it's corrected. Now, the stellar year. So the lunar year is the earliest, but the stellar year, based on stars, is very ancient and very precise. It is based on fixed stars, not the sun. And examples are the Pleiadians' return or Sirius's heliacal rising. Okay, this is where women knowledge keepers often appear because it requires long-term memory, oral transmission, and ritual continuity. All right, so Egypt's Sirius year is one of the clearest examples. Solar year comes later and gains dominance, and this is the 365 days formalized for agriculture at scale, taxation, bureaucracy, and empire. Okay, so the solar year we see today is pure colonization, and not just colonization of certain specific places, but the idea of colonizing the entire planet into a specific time zone. All right, this is fixed authority that was decided by a group of people. The rest of us didn't get to decide. This was all decided in Washington, D.C. in the 1800s. Okay, so who formalized the year in writing, or so codified it? Okay, so we have the Sumerians, which I've been talking about in relation to Enheduanna. The Sumerians used lunar solar calendars, and the month names is tied to festivals. So this is where we see names of the month. We borrowed that from the Sumerians. Okay, and then we have Enheduanna's era, where the Venus cycles were woven into ritual time. Then we have the Egyptians. They have the 365-day calendar linked to Sirius, specifically to Sirius. And then we have the Romans calendar, which later imposed administrative solar calendar. So Julius Caesar, which is where we get the Julian calendar, and then Pope Gregory, which is where we get the Gregorian calendar. This is the one we use today. This is the one we use in the Americas, okay? So the pattern is earlier, it was lunar, stellar, and ritual. And then more modern, or in today's world, so to speak, it is solar, bureaucratic, and imperial. And we'll finish around this, so the long video, the indigenous star year. So I always like to bring it back to the Americas, to the indigenous great mothers, okay? So the indigenous star year is not 365 numbered boxes, January to December, a floating abstraction, or this squared kind of deciphering of time. It is a cycle of star appearances anchored into moon counts, verified by land events, meaning plants, animals, and weather, and then remembered through story, ceremony, and song. The stars tell when the sun's influence will change, not the other way around, okay? The Pleiades in North America is the great timekeeper. Nations that include the Pleiades are the Lakota, Dakota. You know, a lot of these tribes, I did a little bit of influence around their great mothers, or what were considered great beings of elemental influence, okay? So the Kiowa, the Cherokee, the Hopi, the Dene, the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois, and many of the Pueblo peoples, okay? And what the Pleiades do is they have a heliacal rising similar to Sirius. So the first dawn appearance after visibility. This is what many of the indigenous people of the Americas would recognize. Then they would notice when the Pleiades set and their midnight cumulation. So what we would say in the middle of the night, their accumulation, okay? These moments signaled for us and them new ceremonial cycles, agricultural transitions, social resets, and what we now call New Year, or a year renewal, all right? And for many nations, when the Pleiades return, the year has turned. Not January 1st, not solstice, but when the Pleiades returned. So, it's just to clarify, like, where we also get these moons. Okay, and then the moon counts. Moon counts and stars equal the year. So most North American systems work like this. They have 12 to 13 moons. Each moon is named for a natural event, a behavior, or a relationship, aka like when the berries ripen, right? And I've talked about this, like when we would name our descendants, when we would name certain things, we based it off of nature, and oftentimes the moon, okay? So moon counts are corrected by stars so that they don't drift. So even though the moon shifts, the stars stay fixed, okay? So the correction given to the moon cycles, what helps correct the moon cycles or give it specific steadiness are the Pleiades, so Orion, Sirius, aka Sopdet, and then Ursa Major and Minor, aka the Big Dipper, okay? This is extremely sophisticated timekeeping. Not based on the sun, based on the stars and the moon, okay? And this is what the peoples used to do. So the Plains Nation, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Kiowa used Ursa Major and Minor as the year wheel. This is where the theory of where the so-called swastika comes from, because it actually represented the positions of Ursa Major and Minor, okay? And then we have that its rotation marks seasonal relationships. Then also the Pleiades, so they would look not only at Ursa Major and Minor, but we would look at the Pleiades and Orion. So Pleiades were seed time and renewal, and Orion was winter stories and teaching time. So that's obviously teaching time. Might have been what we called the season winter, okay? Winter is not a season, it is a time of stories because stars are the strongest. Winter is not a season, it is the time of stories because stars are the strongest. Okay, and then we go into the southwest. We got the Hopi, Dene, and Pueblo. Orion and Pleiades guide planting. Kachina cycles align with the star movement. This is why they have names like the red star Kachina, blue star Kachina, etc. Solstices matter, but only as confirmations, not the headline, not the leaders, not the in front part. And the Hopi, it is said, this is the information I got, I haven't checked with anyone specifically Hopi to solidify this, but it is said that they say the stars are our calendar. Okay, and then we get into the Enheduanna-Sumarian and the Algonquin. Those are moon calendars which govern ceremonies. Star knowledge ensures alignment. And then the midwinter ceremony is not solar, it is lunar stellar reset. Okay, midwinter ceremony. All right. The Enheduanna-Sumarian new year begins when, or the new renewal begins when the moon, the ceremonial conditions, and star positions align, not a fixed date. This is how we used to practice. The colonizer, Julius Caesar, and Pope Gregory are who gave us the calendar that we follow today. And through those dictators, so to speak, gave our perception of the sun, moon, and stars, the importance of them, how they get then linked to religious scripture. Okay? Now, the name, I mentioned the turtle's back, okay? The 13 moons and the 28 markings for the lunar days. So this is what is called body time, not clock time, all right, or nature time, all right? So who kept this knowledge? Women. Women kept this knowledge. Grandmothers, midwives, story keepers, and ceremony holders. They were the great mothers, okay? Not always publicly named, but functionally central, all right? Which is, time knowledge was intergenerational, embodied, included emotional awareness, and it was highly protected, which is why colonization attacked language, ceremony, and star stories. It not only attacked star stories, but took the star stories and turned them into their own whitewashed, colonialized deities. Okay? Because who controls time controls reality. All right? And that brings us back to like the Greenwich story. All right? Okay. All right, a little kind of like bringing it all in. So Enheduanna was a high priestess of Inanna, and the high priestess of Inanna means you are a high priestess of Venus. Okay. Enheduanna was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, and she's the first known named author in history. All right. What matters is Inanna equals Venus, and Venus governs cycles of disappearance and return, descent and ascent, political legitimacy, intimate and creative and destructive powers. All right. Enheduanna's hymns track Venus as a timing intelligence because of the song, not just something kind of not performed. I mean, performed in honor and reverence, but part of an embodied way of being, okay? And so when Venus disappears, a lot of ruckus can happen, and when Venus returns, order is restored. It was simple, okay? It was simple. And then Inanna and the morning star, and then the women, plains, and plateau. So many plains and plateau nations hold stories of a morning star woman or a star woman. She appears from the sky, brings law, agriculture, and renewal, often associated with Venus as the morning star. Names vary. So we have the Lakota morning star traditions, they have the Cheyenne star woman narratives, and have the Crow and Pawnee morning star rites. Very carefully held knowledge, okay? And then when it kind of mirrors, or there's a link or a resonance with Enheduanna, Venus as being who moves between worlds, the appearance at the right time, like whenever she appears, that's when you act, that's the right time to act. When she disappears, it's danger, inversion, or limited resources, so to speak, or maybe water or something along like that. Like they paid attention to Venus. And this is not just curious astronomy, this is governance by sky rhythm. And this is what Inanna's hymns reflected from Enheduanna's influence, authority, and teachings, okay? And then we have with the indigenous sky women, falls from the sky world, descends into darkness, lands on the turtle's back, gives birth to the world as it is now. Star story, okay? She's not Venus explicitly, but she embodies the same cosmic logic. Descent, darkness, and the feminine body as a calendar, okay? And then with Enheduanna, when she writes of Inanna, aka Venus, descending, losing power, entering the underworld, returning transformed. Okay? Star lore. Again, just saying, star lore. Both cosmologies encode creation happening through descent, not domination. This is from watching the rising and falling of Venus. Venus disappears below the horizon, Sky Woman falls. Both Sky Woman and Inanna return as world shapers, okay? Now, Inanna is known as the Queen of Heaven. The Pleiades are known as the mothers of multiple nations, okay? The indigenous star mothers. So, in the Americas, the Pleiades are often the seven sisters, the seven mothers, the grandmothers, the mothers, not seven, but the mothers, and the origin beings. And just a simple reminder of Orion and origin and the link between those words, right? They, the Pleiades, govern the turning of the year, ceremonial renewal, agricultural timing, and social balance. Okay, this is linked to the indigenous star mothers, where Venus governs power cycles, Pleiadians govern year cycles. Okay, but this was something we paid attention to both, right? Venus and the Pleiades. Okay. I already went into the link with the songs. Okay. So what this has shown me is that Enheduanna, who was considered Sumerian, her Venus hymns, and then we have our great mothers of the indigenous North Americas, the great mothers of the Americas, and their star mother traditions reflect a mirrored system of lunar stellar timekeeping, where planetary cycles were what governed ritual, authority, and renewal long before the sun calendar was standardized and basically forced upon the world. Okay, and just kind of bringing it to the end and then letting you know what we're going to go into next as far as great mothers and their link to the stars. So when it comes to calendric memories and behavior, we used to sing, because singing taught us when to plant, when to fast, when to grieve, when to celebrate, and when to realign with what we now call divine order, or with community order or nature order. And this was seen with people of Sumer, Egypt, Israel, Greece, indigenous cultures worldwide. Okay, not just the Americas. And so what I want to go into next, and it will be, hopefully I'll be able to bring all of these great mothers into the same video, but we're going to talk about Hypatia, who was one of the founding mothers, one of the well-known mothers of mathematics, astronomy, and truth around both of those things. Annie Jump Cannon classified. She is responsible for the classification of stars. Cecilia Payne Gaposchkin helped figure out stellar composition. She figured out what stars are made of. Okay. Henrietta Leavitt, she is responsible for figuring out the measuring of the universe. The measuring of the universe. Like, what? Caroline Herschel is a comet hunter. She is responsible for figuring out and naming many comets. Wang Zhen Yi, Zhenyi, Wang Zhenyi, I think is how you say that. Forgive me for my mispronunciation. She is responsible for explaining eclipses. Then we have Maria Mitchell. She is a link with the meridians, time, and comets. Comets, not comets, comets. And then the indigenous great mothers are responsible for the moon, Venus, and Pleiades keepers, literally watching them constantly. So, and that's just a few of some of the great mothers. There are others that highly influenced what we now consider star lore and star information. All right, so that's the video for this day, this time. Thank you for watching, subscribing, listening, joining. Thank you for your super chats and your membership, your support, for being a great mother yourself. And for hanging out with me while I talk about great mothers, star lore, and remembrance. All right, until next time.